In the final 5 seconds of recorded data, the Cessna Citation 550 carrying NASCAR legend Greg Biffle and 6 others was indicating 93 knots. For context, the reference speed for a citation on short final is typically around 115 to 120 knots depending on weight. 93 knots is not an approach speed, it is a stall warning. When investigators recovered the throttle quadrant from the wreckage, both levers were found in the full forward position. Someone in that cockpit recognized the energy state was critical and commanded maximum power. But at 93 knots descending through the last 100 feet, with the runway still 1,300 feet away, no amount of thrust could overcome what physics had already decided. This aircraft was behind the power curve. Oh, and understanding that concept might save your life? December 18th, 2025. Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina. A 44-year-old Cessna Citation 550 registration, November 257. Bravo Whiskey was returning to the airport it had departed just 10 minutes earlier. On board were 7 people, including Biffle, his wife Christina, their children Emma and Ryder, family friend Craig Wadsworth, and pilots Dennis and Jack Dutton. They had encountered instrument failures shortly after takeoff and made the reasonable decision to return. The weather was marginal, but workable. Visibility 5 miles in drizzle, ceiling 1,200 feet above ground level. For a crew with functioning instruments and a stable approach, this was entirely manageable hour, but this approach would be neither. Think of an aircraft's energy state like a bank account. You have 2 currencies, airspeed, which is kinetic energy, and altitude, which is potential energy. You can trade between them, pull back on the stick, and airspeed converts to altitude. Push forward and altitude converts to airspeed. But here is the critical concept. This account has a minimum balance requirement. Fall below it, and you are bankrupt. No amount of engine power can save you because the physics simply do not work anymore. At 10:13 and 3 seconds, the crew requested flaps. 19 seconds later, the landing gear. Both actions increase drag significantly. In a normal approach, you compensate by adding power to maintain your target airspeed while descending on a stable glide path. The published approach for runway 28 at Statesville uses a 3-degree glide slope, standard for most instrument approaches. But the NTSB data tells us something was wrong from the beginning of this approach, and the Citation was descending toward the runway from the east. The crew had visual contact with the ground. At 1,900 feet, they confirmed they could see the runway. But between that moment and impact, something fundamental changed about the aircraft's energy state. The recorded ground speed data shows the aircraft slowing. 114 knots, then 107. Then, in those final 5 seconds, the rapid decay to 93. Simultaneously, the aircraft was descending. The combination of decreasing airspeed and increasing descent rate is the signature of an aircraft falling behind the power curve. Here is how the power curve works. At normal cruise speeds, if you want to descend, you reduce power. Simple. But as you slow down, something changes. The wing requires a higher angle of attack to generate the same lift. That higher angle creates more induced drag. At some point, you cross a threshold where slowing down actually requires more power to maintain level flight, not less. This is the backside of the power curve. On the backside, everything is backwards. If you try to climb by pulling back, you slow down and descend faster. If you add power, the response is sluggish because so much of that power is going to overcome drag rather than accelerating the aircraft. For a Cessna Citation 550 at approach weight, the backside of the power curve typically begins around 110 to 115 knots, depending on configuration. At 93 knots with gear and flaps extended, this aircraft was deep into that regime. The full forward throttle position found in the wreckage tells us the pilot recognized the problem. But here is the cruel physics of the backside. Jet engines do not produce instant power. There is spool-up time. The Pratt & Whitney JT-15D engines on the Citation are reliable and responsive by turbofan standards, but even they require several seconds to go from approach power to maximum thrust. In those seconds, with the aircraft already descending and bleeding airspeed, the energy deficit only grew. The stabilized approach concept exists precisely to prevent this scenario. Most flight operations define a stabilized approach as meeting specific criteria by a certain altitude, typically 1,000 feet in instrument conditions or 500 feet in visual conditions. These criteria include being on the correct flight path, at the correct speed in the correct configuration with power set appropriately, and the aircraft tracking the center line. If any criterion is not met by the gate altitude, the procedure is simple. Go around. Where was the go-around point for this aircraft? The NTSB data shows that at 1,240 feet, mean sea level, approximately 500 feet above the runway, the aircraft was indicating 114 knots and configured for landing. This might have been an acceptable energy state if the approach were stable, but the descent rate appears to have been excessive. The aircraft was not tracking a 3-degree path. It was steeper, hungrier for altitude and airspeed that were not being replenished. Had the crew executed a go-around at 500 feet above ground level, they would have had options. Full power, pitch up, clean up the aircraft, climb away, and either try again or divert to an airport with better conditions or emergency equipment. By the time the aircraft descended through 200 feet above the runway, those options had narrowed dramatically. And by the time the airspeed hit 93 knots at less than 100 feet above terrain, the outcome was essentially determined. The bank account was empty. Why no go-around? We cannot know the crew's decision-making process. The cockpit voice recorder captured their words, but not their thoughts. Several factors may have contributed. First, the crew was dealing with multiple distractions. Instrument failures had plagued them from shortly after takeoff. The gear indicator lights did not illuminate even though the gear appeared to be down. They were operating in marginal weather without ATC assistance. The cognitive workload was enormous. In high workload environments, even experienced pilots can develop tunnel vision, focusing so intently on getting the aircraft on the ground that they lose awareness of the degrading energy state. Second, the pilot may have had conflicting information about the aircraft's actual performance. If the left side flight instruments were still unreliable during the approach, the pilot's perception of speed and altitude may not have matched reality. The right seat pilot was visually acquiring the runway and providing guidance, but visual references in low visibility with drizzle can be deceiving. The runway appears closer or farther, higher or lower, than it actually is. Without reliable instruments to cross-check, the visual illusions can overwhelm even experienced judgment. Third, the nature of the emergency itself may have biased the crew toward landing. They had already tried to leave Statesville and failed. They were returning with a malfunctioning aircraft and deteriorating weather behind them. The idea of going around, climbing back into the clouds with unreliable instruments, and trying again may have seemed more dangerous than pressing the approach. This is a documented phenomenon in accident analysis. Crews facing emergencies often unconsciously lower their go-around criteria because continuing to the runway feels like resolving the emergency, while going around feels like extending it. The first impact point was the easternmost approach light structure, approximately 1,380 feet from the runway threshold. At impact, the aircraft was at an altitude that should have put it well above that structure on a normal 3-degree approach. The fact that it struck a 29-foot-tall light pole at that distance tells us the descent angle was far steeper than 3 degrees. Estimates suggest the aircraft may have been descending at 6 to 8 degrees, perhaps more. This is not an approach. This is a controlled descent into terrain. After striking the first light structure, the citation continued through additional lights and trees before coming to rest in the runway overrun area, approximately 400 feet short of the threshold. Both engines were still attached. Both showed evidence of producing power at impact. The flight controls were found in positions consistent with the pilot attempting to arrest the descent. Everything the pilot did in those final seconds was correct. More power. Arrest the sink rate, fly the aircraft. But the physics had already made the decision. For pilots watching this analysis, the lessons crystallize around a single principle: energy awareness. Know where your aircraft is on the power curve at all times. Know the speeds below which your energy state becomes critical, and most importantly, know when to abandon an approach and go around. The go-around is not an admission of failure, it is the execution of a critical safety procedure. Every airline trains its pilots that a go-around is always an option, until it is not. The specific takeaway from this accident is this: if your approach is not stabilized by your gate altitude, go around. No exceptions. Do not tell yourself you will fix it in the last few hundred feet. Do not convince yourself that you are close enough to make it work. The energy deficit that exists at the gate will only grow as you continue. The backside of the power curve does not forgive. Dennis Dutton had 17,000 hours of flight experience. He had flown airliners across oceans. He was not an inexperienced pilot, but he was a pilot dealing with a cascading emergency in an aircraft with failing systems, and trying to return to the only airport available, in weather that was marginal and getting worse. The decisions he made were human decisions, made under extraordinary pressure with imperfect information. Second-guessing those decisions from the comfort of hindsight is easy. Facing them in real time is something else entirely. Greg Biffle and his family were heading to Florida for the holidays. They trusted the crew. They trusted the aircraft. They had every reason to believe they would land safely. Christina Biffle texted her mother during the flight that they were in trouble. Those were nearly her last words. 14-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Ryder never got to send any words at all. The NTSB investigation will take another 12 to 18 months to determine probable cause. They will examine the electrical failures, the crew qualifications, the ATC communications, the weather, and yes, the approach profile. But for those of us who fly, the time to learn is now, not when the final report is published, now. Because somewhere today, a pilot is flying an unstable approach, telling themselves they can make it work, sliding behind the power curve while the runway threshold moves ever so slightly out of reach. And physics does not negotiate. 93 knots, full forward throttles, 1,380 feet short. The numbers tell the story. Energy cannot be created from nothing. Approaches must be stabilized, and when they are not, the only correct answer is to go around and try again. The crew of November 257. Bravo Whiskey did not get to try again, but maybe the next pilot who watches this will. And that is why we analyze these tragedies, not to assign blame, but to break the chain before the next one begins. Fly safe, manage your energy, and never stop learning.